this session was called originally the Torah after Ferguson. And it then became the Torah after Ferguson and Staten Island. And sadly, I expect that if I gave this talk a year from now, there would be other places to add to that list, which is one of the reasons I think it's important to talk about this. So what I'm going to try and do, in sort of not exactly my usual style in Limmud, is I'm going to actually talk for an extended period, and then I hope we'll have some time, if I time this right, for an extended back and forth, give and take, about what I'll say about the Torah, about the theological piece, and or about race and America's future. Okay. So I want to proceed in three parts. First of all, a few thoughts about human dignity in the Torah itself. Then a little bit about what I think a theology of response to an assault on human dignity might look like. And then third, some thoughts about race and our current American situation. So, Genesis 1 famously begins with the claim, it doesn't begin this way, but Genesis 1 culminates in the claim that each and every human being on the face of the earth is created b'tselem Elohim, in God's image. And as many of you know, interpreters in the whole history of Judaism and Christianity have spent a lot of time trying to figure out a puzzle that they find in that text, which is it's clear that Genesis 1 thinks Tselem Elohim is a very fundamental claim, but arguably it never actually tells us what it means. Right? What does it mean to be created in God's image? And one of the interesting phenomena in the history of Jewish thought is people go hunting for a particular attribute to call the image of God in people. So famously, for Maimonides, it's reason. For the Meshech Chochmah, one of the most interesting rabbinic figures of the early 20th century, it's the capacity to act from a place of inner freedom. For Rav Eliyahu Dessler, a major figure in the Musar movement, it's the capacity to give generously. What's interesting about all that, as a footnote, if you're interested in Jewish thought, is it's an amazing window into what a person thinks is the highest level a human being can achieve. Like, what is the highest form of humanness? What's interesting about it, though, is I would argue it is both biblically totally off and also has a very dangerous underside. The dangerous underside is that anytime you search for what you might call a dignity-conferring characteristic, you always, willy-nilly, write some people out of the human race. And if that's not obvious, you can spend time looking at the way Maimonides talks about people he thinks have not cultivated their minds. They are not yet fully human. This is what I call the theological road to the land of Peter Singer, right? Where you create the possibility that, if human dignity is rooted in characteristic X, well, you don't have characteristic X, so on some level you're not fully human. That's always the danger. That is not the intent almost ever, right? But it's always the danger. But moreover, it's a bad reading, as beautiful as some of the things that have been written are, it's a bad reading of the text. Because the text never makes any claim at all that human beings have something called an image of God, but rather that they are something called an image of God. So Yuval Sherlow, for example, a very interesting rabbi in Israel, writes a book recently, actually a very good book in many ways, about the image of God. And throughout the book, he refers to what he calls Tselem Elohim Sheba Adam, the image of God that is in the human being. Whatever else that is, it is totally unbiblical. Because in biblical thought, you have Tselem Elohim Shehu Ha'adam, right? The image of God that the person is, okay? And if we get to this during the question and answer period, maybe I can say something about, what I think are two dominant strands in biblical thinking about what that actually means. But this is one of the cases where actually knowing something about the ancient Near East is a prerequisite for understanding the pshat of a biblical text, right? I mean, some academics in dogmatic mode would say, that's true about every verse in the Torah, what are you talking about? But this is a case where the ideas in Genesis are simply incomprehensible without knowing what they are talking to. Here's what I mean. In the ancient Near East, throughout the ancient Near East, it is the king who is considered an image of God. That is to say, it is the king who is appointed by God to rule over others and to mediate God's blessings to and for other people. When you begin to understand that, you realize that Genesis 1 is doing something that is so starkly subversive. That is, the claim not only the king, but each and every human being on the face of the earth is an image of God. What this means is that we have here this amazing democratization of a biblical idea. I'm going to say this in two ways, right? That is to say, Genesis 1 makes the claim, we are all kings and queens. The second version is, the implication of that is that when it comes to the realm between us, none of us are. Right? If we are all kings and queens, then no one is a king over anybody else. What is Genesis theology? We are all kings and queens in our relationship to the created order. Right? V'yirdu bidgat hayam, etc. Right? Human beings, right, are meant to rule over the rest of the world, but are not meant from creation to rule over each other. Another lecture for another year, what does that actually mean? What kind of rulership is implied there? Because the reading that somehow implies license to do with the natural world what we want is a horrific reading of Genesis and simply totally untenable is what's going on there. How do I know that? Because biblical texts talk all the time about how they imagine a king conducts himself with his subjects. So I would learn from that how we as kings are meant to conduct ourselves with the natural world. But the point here is very dramatic. All earthly political arrangements are rendered relative. There is no divine right of kings. No one was simply appointed by God at the beginning of the world to rule over anyone else. And maybe for most of us as 21st century Americans, that's an obvious point. But in the ancient world, it's a starkly subversive claim. Where Babylonian theology, for example, holds that the king of Babylon was appointed in the very act of the creation of the world, Genesis 1 replaces that with a radically egalitarian vision of humanity. That is to say, it refuses to sanctify any power structure as ideal. One of the weird consequences of Jewish liturgy is that those of us who are actively engaged with Jewish liturgy have a totally distorted view of biblical views of monarchy. Right? Because the Bible has a whole array of views of monarchy, some of which, like the one in Genesis 1, is enormously suspicious. It's not the only text that is suspicious. But the strand of biblical thinking about the monarchy that made it into our liturgy leaves us praying for the restoration of a Davidic king 3 times a day. Something I imagine Genesis 1 might have found troubling. To be clear, though, this doesn't mean that Genesis 1 rules out the possibility that people will have kings. What it rules out is the possibility that people will have kings who are assumed to be metaphysically chosen by God. It's a pretty dramatic claim. Now, is this about human equality? So here I have to say, I've been on a process of pulling back from something I had said in public many times. I used to think this is clearly a brief for human equality, and now I'm really not sure. By which I mean to say, it's not clear to me that equality is actually Genesis's question. It seems to me that Genesis's question or project is to establish the dignity and even sacredness of every single human being on the face of the earth. What I would say, almost as a footnote to that, is it doesn't seem to me to be a radical step to go from there to talking about equality. But I'm not sure it's the Bible step. Just not sure the Torah itself is making that step. So let's take this one step further. Genesis 1, if we listen to it enough, if we defamiliarize ourselves with it, I think that's one of the great spiritual projects of Talmud Torah, right? Overcoming our sense of over-familiarity with texts. It's what the philosopher Jonathan Lear wonderfully calls the greatest obstacle to learning is knowing. And what do you mean? I can't, Genesis 1, what do you mean? I was 4 years old when I read that text. Right, and so I can't hear it, right? So, Nachum makes the following really beautiful observation about Genesis 1. He says, if you listen to the text again and again and again, everything that God creates that is alive, the text goes out of its way to say God creates it limino or liminehem. That is to say, God creates many kinds of it. Many scholars, this is not Sarna's language, talk about this as Genesis 1 is like a hymn to biodiversity. God doesn't just create animals. God creates animals of all kinds. God creates birds of all kinds. God creates fish of all kinds. Now, if you know something about how rhetorical functions of text works, you read and you expect to hear, oh, and so God creates human beings of all kinds. Vayivra et ha'adam limino. And it never happens. It never happens. And Sarna makes the really interesting observation that he thinks the reason for that is Genesis 1 wants to begin with the claim that at an ultimate level, at a metaphysical level, there are no kinds of people. Right? We'll come back to that more, but there are no kinds of people. Now, Nachum Sarna he was an enormously gifted philologist and scholar. He also had a homiletical side, and Lord knows, I got nothing against homiletics. However, I think this is quite plausibly pshat, right? Especially when you listen to a text, right? You wait for certain things to appear, and they just fall away, right? There are no different kinds or species of human beings. And if that seems far-fetched, or maybe if you think Sarna is not offering us pshat, the plain sense meaning of the text, it is striking that the Mishnah, commenting on the creation of Adam, feels the need to say, right, why was Adam created singly, right? So that no one can say to another, Abba gadol me avicha. My father was greater than yours. That is to say, there is no inequality based on origin. There's no such thing. Right? I think that that's actually the Mishnah's reading of Genesis 1. Now, to be clear, and this is where the Torah is always so much richer than we first imagine, the Torah will go on to laud human diversity and protect it. I've written about, and I'm certainly not the only one who's written about, how that's actually probably what the story of Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Babel, is ultimately really about. A rebellion against an attempt to impose uniformity on people. But what's so striking is that before the Torah will laud and defend human diversity, it feels the need to first say something else, which is something about the oneness of the human species. Yes, Genesis 10 will start talking about geographical diversity, cultural diversity, linguistic diversity. But first, there's some way in which there are no kinds, right? Diversity is to be talked about after we first establish sameness, oneness. One more step in this that I want to take, and again, it is easy to miss this because the text is so familiar. In the ancient Near East, when cultures tell a creation story, commonly what happens is the creation story culminates in the creation of the culture telling the story. So if you've, those of you who can remember, some university introduction to the ancient world, the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, what does it culminate in? The creation of Babylon and its king. When you realize that, it's an astonishing revelation into the Torah, which makes a decision. I'll say it in a more sort of scholarly way and then say it like a normal person. Right? The people of Israel and the land of Israel are not primordial. The Jewish people are not written into the fabric of creation. Right? This is where Kabbalah, I would say, theologically takes a step backward on a certain level, right? That is to say, when you metaphysicalize the people of Israel, Knesset Yisrael, it's beautiful, but it's also terrifying, right? And it's whatever it is, whatever else it is unbiblical, right? The Bible wants no part of that. That's a very dramatic decision. That is to say, we're going to tell a story in which we ourselves do not feature as part of the origin of the world. Maybe that seems, obvious to many of us. But in the ancient world, that's not obvious at all, and it's actually, I think, a conscious subversion. Now, just to be clear, I don't want to overplay this. I mean, the Torah will narrow its focus and be primarily, though I would underline not exclusively, focused with the life and destiny of one particular people. But it is very striking that it refuses to begin there. This is what Bible scholar John Levinson, who has, I can assure you, no liberal political agenda, right? John Levinson calls this the universal horizon of biblical particularism. The universal horizon of biblical particularism. This is to say you cannot understand biblical notions of God's covenant with Israel without first understanding that the Torah has made a choice to begin with Adam and the world. And that is the matzah, how do you say that in English? The basis, the foundation on which everything else gets built. Okay. Activism for a minute, or responding to indignity. I'm very tempted to stop and do 3 rounds of back and forth, but I'm afraid that will derail us. So I'm going to do it this way, despite my hesitation. Jewish theology, as I've just suggested, right, tells us, first of all, that we are created by God. By the way, it's also quite striking. It's not just Jew and non-Jew. It's also male and female, right? To sort of underline a point that maybe should be underlined a lot. But Jewish theology doesn't really tell us that we're created by God, that we're created by God, as we've said, in the image of God, and that we therefore have, at least in the Mishnah's understanding of that, infinite value, each and every one of us. By the way, not only that, but if we take Rabbi Akiva seriously, and also that we are each individually loved by God. Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tzelem. I always tell people that you can, this is like a totally obnoxious thing to say, but you can see the bankruptcy of American Jewish education by when you get up and you say, you know what Rabbi Akiva thinks? God loves you. And then you say, how many people just had the thought, is he Jew for Jesus? And everyone laughs. They wouldn't laugh if there weren't something very profound going on there, right? So each of us is created by God and in God's image. Now, if you stop to take this seriously, the claim is so radical as to be breathtaking. Every human being on the face of the earth, everywhere, is infinitely valuable. There are no, under any circumstances, exceptions, right? So to take Jewish teaching seriously is to strive to affirm the dignity and value of every human being we encounter. I often feel like if we actually took text seriously, no one could ever get past Genesis 1. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. How seriously does Jewish theology take human dignity? It asks us to instill in ourselves a commitment to the transcendent metaphysical worth of every person deep in our consciousness. And it mandates that we conduct ourselves and carry ourselves in the world accordingly. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says in a late midrash, when a person walks on his or her way, a procession of angels walks before him or her and says, make way for an image of the Blessed Holy One. I often think that Jewish ethics on some level would begin with that midrash. What would it mean to walk down the street and imagine a procession of angels standing over every homeless person in New York saying, do you know what this is? Right? It's a dramatic claim, not just about dignity, but about the theological basis and intensity of human dignity. But to take this seriously is to live with an often excruciating tension. And here, to be totally honest, I'm just going to sort of lay my heart on the table. On the one hand, Judaism tells us that every human being matters, and not only matters, but matters in an ultimate way. And yet, on the other hand, we are, all of us, forced to live with the reality that human dignity is trodden and trampled upon in countless ways every day. By cruelty and callousness, by illness and disease, by deprivation and desperation, by pervasive hunger, poverty, political oppression, by horrific loneliness. The extent of human suffering threatens to reduce all of our talk about Tselem Elohim to just so much Pollyanna nonsense, words we say but could not possibly mean. So that leaves us with a predicament. Unless we are willing to shut our eyes and harden our hearts, we cannot but confront the fact that everyday life, not to mention human history, often makes a mockery of our most deeply held beliefs. The ongoing degradation of human beings calls, or ought to call, everything sacred into questions. Do human beings really matter? It is very tempting, I'm trying to figure out how I can best say this. It is very tempting, I feel like, to decide I'm going to purchase my theology by closing my eyes to the empirical reality of the world, or I'm going to jettison theology as hopelessly absurd because all I have in front of me is empirical reality. And I think that on some level, what Jewish spirituality asks of us is the refusal of that choice. But that means being willing to live in and with the chasm between what we say we hold most true and the fact that reality lives an ocean away from that. That's like a very powerful challenge. And I would like to suggest that we earn the right to talk about God at all. Not to mention that we serve God best by committing ourselves to try in whatever small ways we can in the course of our lives to close that gap between a theological claim about human value and a reality that says, oh, please, that's absurd. I would say that's not a bad definition of what it means to live a religious life, and it's also why any attempt to dichotomize between theology and ethics is ultimately bankrupt at its core. Right? That's not to say they're reducible to each other, but to separate them is bankrupt at its core. In my own life, teaching, and writing, I have always tended to focus on the interpersonal dimension of this, on chesed, on learning to be present with and for people during the most vulnerable moments of their lives. This is what Jewish theology calls walking in God's ways, right? And it is in the eyes of many Jewish thinkers, the single highest level a human being can achieve in this lifetime. But, right, side by side with a commitment to chesed is, or ought to be, a commitment to tzedek. Coupled with a commitment to kindness, there is, or ought to be, the pursuit of justice. And sometimes, when the world we live in creates the impression that some lives don't matter, or even simply that they matter less than others, we are obligated to stand up and attempt to close that gap. Now, I want to underline something here. We can disagree about how best to close that gap. I think it is enormously rare that there is a one-to-one correspondence between a theological idea and a particular policy prescription. I'm basically scared of people, right or left, who live in that universe where, oh yes, I just read Noach and I know exactly what my political platform is. Now, I mean, I think there are moments when you can say such a thing, but they're rarer than people might be tempted to say. In other words, there's room to argue about how to do it. There is no room to argue, it seems to me, about the obligation to do it. We are not free to turn away. I don't think that at the end of the day, you can be a religious person and turn away from the reality of human suffering. Now, maybe that sounds like a truism, but you know, to one degree or another, we are all implicated in that crime. Right? We are all implicated in that crime. I say that, you know, not to sort of induce particularly a sense of, you know, oh, we're all so horrible, but actually, no, we're all so obligated, which I think is a different thing, and also a really crucially important one. And before I say something about race in America, I want to say something that is really extremely important to me. Caring is not enough. Caring is what well-meaning, progressive, comfortable bourgeois Jews do. Sorry, you know, that's what we do. We read the newspaper, and we feel bad, and in turn, we feel good about ourselves because we imagine that other people don't even feel bad. No, that's an enormous challenge. It really is an enormous challenge. Caring is not enough. Caring is a crucial first step, but authentic caring leads to acting. It's far too common for people, and just to be clear, this is not a moment when I'm saying you, I am saying we, right? To congratulate ourselves that issues touch us, move us, perhaps even stir in us a sense of righteous indignation. But then we ask the next question, what's for dinner? Right? And it's that I want to really call into question and ask us if that's really why we want to, where we want to live. And I would say it in one more provocative way about Inyana de Yoma, about what's going on right now. It is fine, And in some ways, it is enormously important for American Jews to recall with pride the involvement of Jewish leaders in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. But that struggle for equality is far from over. And to me, at least, it is far more important to strive to be an heir than someone who takes comfort in what they once did. Okay. I want to share, if I could, a few thoughts about race in America. And here, unlike the other things I've said, I'm even less of an expert on this than I am on the other things I've said, but I wanted to share a few thoughts about this. One of the most pressing and intractable problems we face as a nation in America, it seems to me, is an epistemological one, right? Only a philosopher would say that sentence, but I'll try to explain what I mean by that, right? Black people and white people often look at our contemporary world in America and see totally different realities. The Washington Post reported in October that a series of surveys in recent years shows that white people in vast numbers believe that the problem of racial bias against blacks has effectively faded as a national issue. Michael Norton from Harvard, this is amazing, examined data from a series of polls through the years and found in a study he published in 2011 that although both blacks and whites believe anti-black racism has diminished through the decades, whites tend to think it has all but been totally eliminated. In many cases, he found, white perceptions, this is a very gentle way of putting this is what in rabbinic idiom is called lashon sagi nahor. White perceptions of racial disparities diverge from reality. Let's take an example. 2/3 of blacks think that African Americans make less money than whites, a view in line with all official statistics. But just 37% of whites believe that. And a narrow majority think black and whites' incomes are about the same. Now, I don't want to dance around the point here. It's not an epistemological challenge the way talking about God is, where in the end we have no access to the truth. These epistemological problems can be solved empirically. That is to say, one perception is accurate and the other is simply false, demonstrably false. Amazingly, Norton found, white perceptions of anti-black bias have diminished to the point where white Americans are now more likely to think that anti-white discrimination is a bigger problem than bias against blacks as societal problems in America. So I want to say this again, okay? The persistence of racism in America is not an impression or an intuition. It is a fact demonstrated by abundant empirical research, right? There is nothing, this is not like you and I can disagree. I watch MSNBC, you watch Fox News. It's not that. It's actually, there's a vast ocean of empirical literature here. Professor Randall Kennedy from Harvard writes the following. It's like this a wonderful summary of this. Intentional, invidious racial discrimination constitutes a force in American life that is far from negligible. It is a substantial headwind that blacks and other racial minorities face in many key areas, including housing, finance, employment, criminal justice, electoral politics, and markets for romance and marriage. There is a library of empirical literature establishing this fact beyond sensible controversy. But crucially, and this is the next step I would like to take in here, because I think this is actually potentially the key to find a way to talk about in America, as an already vast and ever-growing body of social scientific research shows, much of the most insidious and damaging racism in America today is in fact not intentional or conscious. Take an example of this. Not long ago, 2 scholars sent out nearly 5,000 identical resumes in response to help wanted ads. The only difference between those resumes was stereotypical white-sounding name at the top, stereotypical black-sounding name at the top. Brendan and Jamal. They found that 50%, the Brendan resumes got 50% more responses than the Jamal resumes. Same resume, same biography. All that was different was the name at the top of the page. A white name, they argued, from an economic model, yields as much benefit as 8 years of professional experience. A recent study published in the American Journal of Sociology found that newly released white felons experience better job hunting success than young black men with no criminal record of any kind. Now, if you ask people, this is a really interesting point, if you ask the people who did not call Jamal or Tyrell for an interview, they would insist that racial prejudice has nothing to do with their decision, and in most cases, they would mean it. Daniel Ames, professor at UCLA, said the following thing, which I find enormously moving. If you ask someone on the hiring committee, none of them are going to say they're racially biased. They're not lying, they're just wrong. They're not lying, they're just wrong. So how should we think about this? Many white people correctly point out that uttering offensive racial slurs in public has become verboten. You can't be a member of the KKK and function in polite society. For heaven's sake, people like to point out, we elected a black president. Although, by the way, there's a vast discussion in social science these days about whether America could ever have elected a president named Tyrell Jones from Detroit. Whether it's precisely an African American who's not really an African American in origin who is able to get elected. That's another discussion for another day. These developments are real and significant, right? I think it's naive to think otherwise. And they do point to genuine racial progress in America. But they do not mean that racism has disappeared. What they mean is that racism has changed form. Because much of the racism that we struggle with in America, not all of it, but much of it is about implicit, unconscious judgments we make. That's what we call in social science implicit bias. What does that mean? People who harbor implicit stereotypes do not think of themselves as prejudiced or racist. Many of them consider prejudice abhorrent. They, like most of us probably, likely do not even know that we carry around these prejudices. And yet, and this is so painful to read, a recent article in the Washington Post talks about this, over 2 million people have taken the online implicit association test, the IAT. And the tests show that white people in all 50 states are biased. By the way, the Northeast did particularly badly, which is fascinating. By the way, keep in mind that the people who go online to take an implicit association test are people who volunteer to do so. They skew younger, more educated, and more politically liberal than the rest of the country. Right? What that indicates is Americans as a whole may well be far more biased than the results of this test alone suggest. So all of this has major implications for who gets a job or an interview for a job, who is treated how when they go see a doctor complaining of pain. Major issue in social science. When black men go to pain clinics, they don't get pain medication because the assumption is they're abusing. Now, but it also has implications, and this is an issue that has become, some of you know, extremely important to me. They also have major implications for who lives and who dies in tense moments. Because to take one very timely example, in the millisecond that an armed police officer has to decide about who is a danger and to what extent, implicit stereotypes are the difference between life and death. Here, too, we need not rely on intuition. There is a growing body of empirical research to indicate this. You can look, by the way, at a fascinating column. I thought it was actually extremely courageous by Nick Kristof in this past summer, where he talks about taking this test that is sadly now not online. I think it will be going back up from the University of Colorado, where you become the officer, and you have a couple of seconds to decide who you have to kill to protect your own life. And Nick Kristof writes, he says, over and over again, I kept killing the unarmed black kids. And I kept saying to myself, Nick, stop. Pay attention to what you really believe. I kept shooting the black kids. By the way, one of the reasons this is very important is I think it is an enormous error in talking about police brutality to accuse your average cop of being a racist. It is far more complicated than that. Many cops are right to be indignant about that. If many of them are racists, many of them are racist implicitly. And if you and I were cops, we might not do much better. Different conversation. The way policing systematically is set up in America's cities, that might be racist unequivocally. But we have to find ways of talking in ways that people can actually hear about a need to heal. And I'm not sure that the sort of temptation of lefty activists to sort of smugly just yell at people all the time actually yields anything. It's very hard to hear that you might have biases you're not aware of when you're being told you're a monster. It's very hard. So something there is much more complicated. So Professor Ames, who I quoted, says the following things, and with this I'm going to come to an end. Racial biases can in some ways be more destructive than overt racism because they are far harder to spot and therefore harder to combat. And we let ourselves off the hook a lot if we say, oh yeah, racism, that's about the KKK and birthers. It is about that. But it's also, painful as it is, about us. I want to zoom out for one last second. New York Times reported earlier this year that the income, just think about this number, the net worth of your average black household in America is $6,314. Compared with white households, $110,500. That's 18 times. That's a greater margin than apartheid South Africa at its lowest point. Meanwhile, the black-white income gap is 40% greater today than it was in 1967. And a black boy born today has a life expectancy 5 years shorter than a white boy born in America today. Black men in their 20s without a high school diploma are more likely to be incarcerated than employed. It is forbidden, Jewish sources say, to lie to other people. A prominent Hasidic master, it's one of my favorite Hasidic stories, told his students that for every legal obligation in Judaism, there is a law, din, and there is going beyond the letter of the law, lifni mishurat hadin. His students ask, but Rebbe, midvar sheker tirchak, right? You are forbidden to come anywhere near a lie. What could possibly be going beyond the law in this case? He responded, the law is don't lie. Going beyond the letter of the law is don't lie to yourself. And it seems to me, to be honest, that one of the greatest challenges that we face as a country and as white people in America is to stop lying to ourselves about a very serious problem that we face. And I want to ask you to look at your source sheets for just 1 minute, which I don't think I have a copy of. Yes, I do. A text I discovered, that is to say, it was new to me, I didn't discover it. A text that I first came upon last week. And those of you who read my weekly essays, I quoted it this week. I'm on source 4. I ended up skipping some stuff. Okay? You shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan. Kol olmana v'yatom lo ta'anun. Im anet ta'aneh oto, if you do oppress, ki im tza'ok yitz'ak elai, shamoa eshma tza'akato. If you do oppress him, I will hear his cry. And then comes terrifying biblical threat. V'chara pi v'harakti etchem b'cherev. I will kill you by the sword. That is to say, I will not protect you from a militant aggressor. Your wives will be widows and your children orphans. Now, Ibn Ezra, as is his way, totally focused on grammar, points out this is very strange. The first line of this is in the plural. You can't capture this in English. You all must not. The last line of it is, you'll all be punished. But the middle line is individual, singular, im ano ta'aneoto. And Ibn Ezra suggests that the singular and the plural here are interwoven in a fascinating way. If one person commits the oppression, why does God say, I'll kill all of you? And he says, Lo ta'anun bilshon rabim. You shall not afflict, that is in the plural. Ki mishpat haroim ha'inui vehecherishu, ki mishpat hama'aneh. Because the judgment awaiting those who watched the torment and were silent is the same as the judgment awaiting the tormentors themselves. Therefore it is written, if you singular do afflict them, I will punish you, plural. Now, my point here is not to end with fire and brimstone. My point here is to actually suggest something really, to me, very important. We are all implicated in this problem. And it is a very, very deep problem. And it is one that it seems to me, at the end of the day, you cannot be a religious person, one who holds Tzelem Elohim as an ideal, and not be struggling with, how do I as an individual, how do we as a community, now how do we as an American country respond to this problem? Because it will never go away on its own. Thank you very much. There are practical ways to respond. Look, to be honest, I think radically reimagining policing in black communities is going to be much easier to do, as hard as it is to do, than actually eliminating implicit bias. By the way, one of the most disturbing things is blacks have the same biases about blacks, right? Because they see the same TV shows we do, right? So yeah, this is enormously difficult. It will require, okay, there's so many things to say here. One of them is, how are police officers trained to begin to have conversations with people on the street? Whatever you think happened in Ferguson, and there's an epistemological abyss if ever there was one, right? We're never going to really know what happened in those last moments between Mike Brown and, I just lost his name, Officer Darren Wilson, thank you. But I'll tell you what we do know. We do know that Officer Wilson did not walk up to Mike Brown and say, I'm not sure you should be walking in the street. It's actually not safe. What he said, how he opened the conversation was, we're on TV or I can't say this, was, get out of the street. That was the initial contact. How is that a plausible way to police in a community, right? And that is actually solvable. You don't need to overcome your implicit bias to do that. You don't. We also look, to give a New York example, and I'm not an expert in this, but when you begin to look at what percentage of cases that are arrested in broken windows arrests get dismissed, 50% get dismissed at the first arraignment hearing. And then that's before judges who say, this is ridiculous, I'm throwing this out, right? What does that do to the relationship between a community and those who are meant to police it? Which is why blacks say all the time, yeah, whites say that, the police forces make them feel safe. Okay. If I'm a black person living on the Upper West Side, I feel that way too. If I'm a black person living in the South Bronx, I don't feel that way. That's a very complicated project, but that is actually solvable with political will. Not something that we necessarily have, but it's solvable with political will. Then we can talk about what would training around implicit bias look like. And here, I think it's really important for those who have criticism to have some humility. Cops are scared, and they're right. It's a really scary job, right? Demonizing, I can't say this enough time, demonizing individual officers is always a mistake. Calling into question modes of police training and police conduct strikes me as morally urgent. Those are two different things. I will tell you, by the way, if you haven't read some of this stuff, the response of the Black Policemen's Union in New York to Pat Lynch has been totally fascinating, right? Where the Black Policemen's Union basically said, if there's really not a problem of racial bias in New York City policing, how come every black cop has been stopped for driving while black? Why is that? Why? Ask any black cop, have you ever experienced this? Overwhelmingly said yes, right? Something is going on there. So it is about the courage to face it, which is why I talked about that Hasidic text, right? Not telling ourselves the truth about ourselves, is very tempting. But it's also, let's say, religiously forbidden and morally dangerous. How do we get people for whom the conversation about systematic inequality is, let's say, a non-starter to actually engage in that struggle and that work? And my answer to this, for whatever it's worth, and I'm certainly no expert on this, but it's the same answer I would have to almost every question like this. It's actually not about talking about systematic equality, which is an abstraction. It's about putting before people faces of human beings, right? It's not about how police treat the black community. It's about why Ramarley Graham ended up dead. Can I just say this? I'm not trying to embarrass anyone. How many people here know who Ramarley Graham is? Ramarley Graham was killed by a police officer 3 years ago last week. Ramarley Graham was walking down the street. And as he was walking down the street, the police officer saw him adjust his pants and decided that he must be carrying a gun. Ramarley Graham walked home. The police broke down his family's front door. No warrant, by the way. Broke down his door. Ramarley Graham was hiding in the bathroom. The police broke down the door to the bathroom. They saw Ramarley Graham holding his pants, so they shot him in the chest in front of his grandmother and his 6-year-old brother, and he was killed on the spot. That's the NYPD. Now, I know that makes all of us, it's very hard to process this kind of stuff. And there was an indictment in that case, and the judge threw the case out on a technicality about the instructions that the prosecutor had given to the jury. And so now there's a movement afoot, you can go online and learn about this, to try and convince the DOJ, the Department of Justice, to appoint a special prosecutor in this case. Right? Now, this is not about, so my answer to Lauren is, like, honestly, this is not about black people. This is about Ramarley Graham and his little brother. That's what this is about. This is about how is that possible? I'll give you another example just very personally, and I've said this a million times in public. When I was arrested protesting police brutality on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, one of the most poignant moments for me, I was standing with Rabbi Jill Jacobs in a talit, and the policeman who arrested me said to me, after he put the handcuffs on me, pointed to my talit and said, "Sir, is it okay if I touch this?" And I have to say that part of me wanted to break down in tears. Really? Like, I just kept watching the Eric Garner video over and over again in my mind, right? Really? "Sir, is it okay if I touch this?" What does it actually mean to take that seriously, right? So, like, I think the danger is always making it about issues. No one cares about issues. I really actually think that I mean, I'm overstating the point. Very few people care about issues. They care about people. And that's the challenge. And look, we're in the process in human history of an ongoing evolution in this way. Right? Like, we are still coming to see black people as fully human. We are in the early stages of coming to see gay people as fully human. And we are almost not even at the early stages of coming to see people with disabilities as fully human. This is an enormous project of the maturation of a notion of Tselem Elohim that we would take seriously. That's what this is. I think that's what this is. This is actually, and it's hard. It's really hard. And we would rather, and here again, we would all rather, like, I would rather my religious life be about who's coming for Shabbos this week. But it actually, I'm not allowed that. Not if I really take Torah seriously. I'm actually not allowed that. I'm not. Because I know from the Haftarah of Yom Kippur what God thinks about that. What the hell are you doing here? So that's that's a basic claim. And for me, there's nothing politically radical about this at all. It's just about Tselem Elohim. And for those of you who know me, like, just to speak very personally, the reason I chose very consciously to be arrested that night is that I have a reputation in the Jewish community for being very liberal, but nobody's idea of a leftist. Just ask my students. Nobody's ideas of a leftist. You can ask my students. I can always count on the students in Machon Hadar, no matter what I say and how left it is, I will always be attacked from the left. No, I'm serious. And that, you know what? And it was a very conscious decision. To the extent that I have any capital to spend here, I'm going to make this a mainstream issue. I'm not going to let them just walk away with this. By the way, people I admire, don't mishear this, but like the usual suspects. Like, this is an issue about what it means to take Torah seriously. Not, to me, a particularly partisan project. By the way, I think the issue of police brutality should be, and is slowly becoming, an issue of the far right as well. Right? There is no better Tea Party issue than the militarization of police departments all across this country. If ever there is a case of government overreach in this country, it is that. I don't want this to be a partisan issue. It's also not a partisan issue because we're going to have to take on the police unions who protect rogue cops all the time. Every time a police department tries to punish a rogue cop, the unions protect him. This cuts party lines in all kinds of interesting, and I would say, maybe revealed my own political biases, very productive ways. I don't think that humanizing people is the last step. I think it's what makes the conversation possible in the first place. When the kid who can't learn anything because he doesn't have enough food isn't just a kid, but he has a name and a face. I mean, I have a student who I admire, immensely, a student who learned at Machon Hadar, Yeshivat Hadar, a couple summers ago, who teaches in an inner city in the Midwest. And I asked him, because he's talked about how Jewishly it's like there's nothing there for him. And I said, what are you doing there exactly? Like, why are you still there? And he said, Rav Shai, you have to understand, like, the first time a young kid came up to me and said, hey, do you happen to have any food in your bag because I'm really hungry? I realized I can't leave. And like I said to him, you know what? Your religious life is so much more precious than all the rest of us BSers, right? No, really, right? Like, man, like that's responding to, those of you who were in my session this morning, like that's a moment of responding in Buber's mode, right? Like I see this kid and it makes a claim on me. So yeah, I mean, look, I think we love in this society to get distracted by the wrong debates. I'll give you a very clear example of this. I want to say, I genuinely know nothing about what I'm about to say. However, I'm going to say it anyway, okay? It's not a bad description of my career. No, no, but no, really, because I think it actually is really an interesting problem. So there's, as you all know, enormous debates between public school advocates who think that the charter school movement is a disaster, and charter school advocates who think that the public school advocates are recalcitrant and stubborn and impossible. I have no capacity to evaluate any of that. But I will tell you what's interesting. All the social science indicates that there is a much better answer to either public schools or charter schools for kids who are poor. Make them less poor. But that's a real thing, right? I mean, we laughed at it, but it's true. Now, I understand that's harder, but like all the research indicates that. There are now social scientists, education researchers who say everyone should shut up because this debate is actually an obfuscation of the real issue here, which is you couldn't learn if your parents couldn't afford to have a single book in their house. Forget about public schools and charter schools for a minute. Let's talk about poverty. But that's hard. Talk about systemic and difficult, right? That's hard. I mean, look, when was the last time we had a candidate who ran for president who said, not I want to be the candidate of the middle class, I want to be the candidate of the lower class? Lyndon, yeah, John Edwards briefly, Bill Bradley briefly, but yeah, I mean, so I don't know how to answer your question, but it's the right question. And it's why I actually ended the part on race by talking about police brutality and didn't begin there. Like, I'm interested in the fact that, like, 20 blocks from where some of us live, there are black kids who haven't had breakfast and they're expected to learn something in school. It can't be. Police brutality is a major, major crisis in this country for which there are many causes and some very elusive solutions, but it is a manifestation of something much deeper and more foundational, which is, as I said before, we are in the process, as a human race, of actually learning that black people are Tselem Elohim. It is disgraceful, it is appalling, it is horrible that we need until the 21st century to learn that, but we do, there it is. I mean, there it is. That's just where we are. Maybe we ought to begin with the things we can do, like changing the nature of policing and police training. But somehow we're going to have to do serious work here about Tselem Elohim. Like that's what I meant when I said, it wasn't clear before, how I think somehow if we took text seriously, we would never get past Genesis 1. Or, as I think about a lot, if we took text seriously, we would never get past the first sentence of Birkat HaMazon. How could you? Hazar et ha'olam kulo betuvo. Right? God who creates enough food for the entire world in God's goodness. How is third world poverty not a theological question? How? Because, I'm busy singing and teaching my kids the tune. No, I'm not trying to say that obnoxiously, right? That's just what we do. But it's a stunning theological claim. God creates enough food for everyone on earth to be fed. Yeah, and look at that world. I cannot tell you, as someone who cares about Torah probably more than almost anything else except for my children, what it is like for me to understand that the most brutalizing discourse in Israel about Sudanese refugees comes from religious parties. The rate comes from religious parties in Israel. The brutalizing discourse about the Sudanese refugees, who are blacks but not Jews. So, it's very complicated. Yeah. I mean, so, look, I have no idea how to end a talk like this other than to say this. The goal of this is not to leave you walking out of here feeling deflated. The goal of this is to leave every one of us asking, what can I do to step into that breach between the claim of Tzelem Elohim and the reality of a world in which human dignity is trodden upon? What am I asked to do? And just to sort of say honestly, I have no idea yet what the answer is for me. I say that because I don't want you to hear this as somehow I'm standing on some high horse yelling. I don't know what the answer is. But I do know that, like, sorry, I'm too busy, or, religion is something else, right? It's just like stuff we do on the weekends. Like, that's just not an answer if you take religion seriously, as opposed to see it as sort of like, a bourgeois hobby, which is frankly what most of us as American Jews do, right? Let's just kind of call it what it is. But if we take the claims of these texts seriously, somehow we are asked, like, how will you respond? How will we, at the end of the day, have contributed to the closing of that gap? Or to put it differently, how will we have lived lives that reflect that we take Genesis 1 seriously and not just as a piece of poetry? Thank you very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.